Hey everybody, Coach Mark here. And before we dive into today's topic, make sure to find me over on Instagram as Coach Mark Estrabio. Also, I offer one-to-one coaching. It's what I do full-time and the odds are very good. I'd love to work with you. With that being said, let's get into it. If you've followed this channel for any amount of time, it's no secret that I love the conjugate method, and what I'm going to be doing over the next several videos is detailing what conjugate really is and my own individual application of it as well as use cases. The first video in the series is all about understanding what conjugate really is, how I define it in my application, and also understanding West Side Barbell and the 5G problem. Now, when it comes time to define conjugate, I think something that's worth mentioning is understanding the West versus East debate. For a lot of us, when we think about conjugate, it is synonymous with West Side Barbell and Louis Simmons. And Louis Simmons himself, he was heavily influenced by Soviet sports science. Two particular sources that he refers to are the USSR's Dynamo Barbell Club and their practice of rotating through multiple special exercises to improve athletic performance, as well as super training by one Yuri Verkhoshansky and Mel Sif. In creating the West Side conjugate system, Louis sought to solve some of the problems you would see in a traditional, more linear periodization programs by improving multiple aspects for powerlifters concurrently. And again, it's worth mentioning, West Side Barbell and its conjugate system was designed with equipped powerlifting in mind. Whereas if we look to the Eastern definition of conjugate training, I will refer to Yuri Verkhoshansky here as he was one of the big influences with his book, Super Training. And he would refer to conjugate training as using special exercises as well as technical exercises in the same training session, and then ultimately the training would evolve to different sequenced training sessions, and then lastly into different sequenced training stages. Now, I really want to focus in on Yuri's definition of conjugate, especially that latter part, different sequenced training stages. When Yuri came up with the conjugate sequence system, he believed exercises needed to move in a specific order. This method used a sequential process wherein movement variations were used at different times and phases. It all moved towards a specific end rather than consistent rotation. And when you order them and build them upon one another, this is a type of block periodization, wherein you might go from accumulation, which is a more general base building phase, to transmutation or intensification, where specificity increases and intensity also increases while dropping volume. And then lastly, into realization, which is the peak of your performance, wherein everything is highly specific. Again, bear in mind, a lot of Yuri's work was centered around high jumpers, as the conjugate sequence system was a general athletic development template. Now, in defining conjugate, let's look a bit about that word in and of itself. By definition, conjugate means to be coupled, connected, or related. In both applications of this system, both Louis and Yuri, conjugation occurs. However, the discrepancy comes from the how and the when. In Yuri's system, the conjugation occurs via sequencing of the training phases wherein they're all connected and related to one another. Each block builds upon the last. There's a focused progressive development. Whereas Louis' West Side Barbell conjugate system, conjugation occurs because it is a concurrent training method with rotating exercises, and you are training all aspects during all phases. Multiple qualities are trained at once, and the variation in and of itself is there to help prevent stagnation and stay ahead of diminishing returns. Now, what is the 5G problem? I was talking with my friend Chad Chili about West Side and conjugate training, and he made the reference that West Side itself is a concurrent style of training, which Yuri said as well. Now, what I likened it to is the 5G situation. If you recall, when 5G first came out, these networks were actually not truly 5G. They did not fit these specific technical specifications, but they kept getting called 5G over and over and over, and eventually we just accepted that that was the definition of 5G. In much the same way that Louis' version of conjugate became the go-to definition here in the West, even though it wasn't necessarily the original. Over time, Louis has stuck, and that's why we're at where we're at today, and why I want to talk about the two differing definitions of conjugate. Are you confused? Fantastic. Let's make it even more confusing by introducing some history. In much the same way that Rome split into the Western and Eastern empires, but both were still Rome, no Byzantines actually called themselves Byzantines, they called themselves Roman. What if we were to say that both West Side Barbell and block periodization, or Yuri Verkhoshansky's iteration of block periodization, are indeed conjugate? So with the Western system, we're looking at concurrent training year-round, exercise rotation to address weaknesses. It's built for constant readiness and was developed for powerlifting. Whereas Yuri's style of conjugate was a sequential development of athletic qualities, training blocks designed to peak at very specific times. It was ideal for in-season or goal-specific preparation, and is a system for organizing athletes' training. Both conjugate, both Rome. Now this is where I'm going to talk about my particular definition of conjugate, and I look at it as a unified approach. Prior to making this video, I'd actually posted several times about how I often didn't use conjugate as I understood it, aka Louis Simmons' definition of conjugate, when peaking my athletes for strongman competitions, but instead would use more of a block approach. Ultimately though, what this meant is I was going from conjugate to conjugate. Recognizing that, here is the definition that I would like to use. Conjugate is a wave-based concurrent training framework designed to improve multiple physical qualities at once, with the flexibility to refine and emphasize specific traits through sequenced phases when needed. So to help keep this series a lot more practical, I'm mainly going to be focusing in on general and developmental side of conjugate training. This is the stuff that builds multiple of elements of fitness concurrently, so think more Louis Simmons style West Side Barbell inspired. Peaking for an individual show or for a specific timeline is highly individualized. Very important, but naturally beyond the scope of this series, that's more of a one-to-one thing. So know when I say conjugate, I'll be talking about the day-to-day system and principles that I found maximize compliance and enjoyment of training long-term. Essentially building the best possible version of yourself in the off-season before jamming the metaphorical square peg in a round hole necessary for block periodization and peaking performance for a specific competition. Also, just so we are abundantly clear, this is not about powerlifting. Now, I do want to make a few very important acknowledgments here. Louis Simmons' contributions to sports science are immeasurable, and I think we still haven't come to fully appreciate how much he's actually done for us. He is a true needle mover. This entire series will not be discussing conjugate in the context of powerlifting, but more strongman, power building, and lifestyle training. I'm also going to make this clear, I am not arguing that this interpretation of conjugate is necessarily better, but it's simply one that has worked better for myself and my athletes versus either classic iteration because it allows you to go from one style to another, a unified Rome. So what you need to understand is conjugate isn't one specific idea or one modality of training. It's a nuanced, multi-layered system. Louis made it accessible and effective for general strength, but it was designed specifically for equipped powerlifting, whereas Yuri's built his for precision and performance peaking as a system for athletes. Both work. I want to talk about how we're going to be unifying and rectifying the two different approaches over the course of this video series. So that wraps up the first video in this series. Again, all we were doing today was defining what conjugate is and is not and understanding there's a bit of a unification process throughout this. In the next video, I'll be going over the 3-effort method model, as well as discussing my 3 big influences and how I came to arrive with my own iteration of conjugate. Hope you folks found something useful, and I'll catch you in the next one.